All right, so today we're going to be talking about completing the square and perfect squares. So first, a perfect square trinomial. So if you have the trinomial x squared plus 8x plus 16, we factored some of these beforehand. And then 1 times 16 would be 16, and bring down the 8. The factors of 16 are 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. So all of these multiply to give you 16, but we need a set that adds and gives you 8, and the only one that's going to do that is 4 and 4. So those are it. And then we have our factor terms. It would be x plus 4 times x plus 4. But when you have the same thing multiplied against itself, the correct way to write that in the most simplified version would be x plus 4 squared. These trinomials that come out to be factored out like this are called perfect square trinomials. Just like how a perfect square was like 16, where it's 4 times 4, a number times itself to get that one, yeah. So if you take this binomial x plus 4 and you square it, you're going to get this trinomial. The resulting trinomial is called a perfect square trinomial. So why it's important is because if you have a perfect square trinomial, you can solve your quadratic equation by square roots. So it's easier, it'll come out nicely. All right, let's try this one. X squared minus 12x plus 36 equals 81. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna factor the left side, which is gonna be a perfect square trinomial. Then we're gonna solve the equation by square roots. And then remember, like we talked about the last time, every positive square, if you take the square root of a positive number, it always has 2 square roots, the positive version and the negative version. So we're gonna have to solve for both cases. So starting with this one, 1 times 36 is 36, bring down the negative 12. So the factors of 36 are 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9, and 6 and 6. Now we need 2 numbers that are gonna, when you combine them, they give you a 12. And that's gonna be 6 and 6 right here. And they're gonna have to be negative because a negative 6 times a negative 6 is gonna give you a positive 36. And a negative 6 minus 6 is gonna give you a negative 12. Okay, well then this would be x minus 6 times x minus 6, which would then, well that's still equal to 81. And well, you can write this as x minus 6 squared equal to 81. And then from here, we're gonna solve using square roots. So we're gonna square root both sides. And this is gonna give us x minus 6 because the square root of a square, these two cancel each other out, is equal to plus or minus 9. And then by adding by 6 on both sides, we're gonna have x equals 6 plus or minus 9. Plus or minus is you can either add, you're gonna do both. So taking this up here, you're gonna do 6 plus 9 to get 15. You're also gonna do 6 minus 9, and you're gonna get negative 3. So the answer to this one would be x is equal to negative 3, 15. The reason we write plus minus in reverse is because 9 is either positive, 9 is positive, and 9 is negative. So right here, when we got here, we just broke it up into the positive case and the negative case. You could have broken it up right here and gone, well, I want to do x minus 6 equals a positive 9, x minus 6 equals a negative 9, and then solve for x that way too. So, okay. So that was a perfect trinomial, a perfect square. But sometimes When you don't have a perfect square trinomial, you can actually create one. This is called completing the square. So we're gonna follow these next couple, 4 steps, I believe, yes, 4 steps to complete the square. All right, so step number 1 is to rewrite. We're gonna rewrite our trinomial as x squared plus bx equals c. So if we're given the trinomial x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0, then our first step is to subtract by 7 on both sides, move this constant to the other side. This one's going to be step number 1. And we're going to rewrite it as x squared plus 8x equals negative 7. All right, then. The next step, step number 2, is to take half of b. Then we're going to square it. Then we're going to add it to both sides. So what this means is we're going to take b over here. We're going to take half of it. Well, 8 divided by 2 is 4. And then you're going to square that. And you're going to get 16. So then you're going to add 16 on both sides. So then step number 2, after you've added 16 on both sides, would be to rewrite them. So x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals negative 7 plus 16 is a positive 9. Now this step right here is legit because remember, what you do to one side, you can do to the other. So we're not changing the equation at all. We're not changing the value of the equation at all if you add the same thing to both sides of the equation. Okay. Then your third step is going to be to factor the perfect square trinomial, because that's what you've created, a perfect square trinomial. So then factoring the left side, we would have 16 and 8. Again, we kind of already solved this one ahead of time. So we already know that's 4 and that's 4. And we already know it's going to actually be written as x plus 4 squared. Well, that's equal to 9. And I actually should have written that. That's step number 3. Okay, and then the fourth and last step is to take the square root of both sides and solve for both cases. So we're going to take the square root of the left and we're going to take the square root of the right. And the square root of something being squared cancels out. So it's going to leave us with x plus 4 equals, well, the square root of 9 is plus or minus 3. So right here, you could actually split it off and go x plus 4 equals a positive 3 and x plus 4 equals a negative 3. And then solve by subtracting by 3 on both sides. Or by subtracting by 4 on both sides. And then on this side, you get x equals a -1. And then on this side, you get x equals a -7. You also could have gone, if you had x plus 4 equals plus or minus 3, you could have subtracted by 4 first, gone x equals -4 plus or minus 3, and then gone -4 plus 3 equals a -1, -4 minus 3 equals a -7. Either way, you can notice that you have x equals on both sides. And you should keep an x equals up there if you're not familiar with it. So the last thing you should have written is that x equals, open parentheses, -7, comma, -1. Close, I didn't mean parentheses, I meant curly brackets. Curly brackets. And that would be your answer right there. Right. Okay, and then let's take into account, the cat thinks my eraser is a toy. The cat thinks everything is a toy. Surprised he hasn't run off with one of my pens by now. Go down, baby. All right, so you might actually get some irrational solutions. So we're actually, if you remember from taking the square root, the last one, we did get some irrational solutions solving quadratics by the square roots, and you did get some irrational solutions. Remember, irrational solutions are numbers under the square root that can't come out evenly. So let's take, for example, x squared minus 2x minus 4 equals 0. Again, we're going to follow the same steps. Actually, we're going to change this by adding by 4 on both sides because we want to move the c to the other side. It's going to give us x squared minus 2x equals a positive 4. Okay, and then from here, you're just going to take that b value. You just want the positive version of it. You just want the number. You're going to half it. And then you're going to square what you got. And so then you're going to add by 1 on both sides. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and solve this trinomial. So net positive 1, negative 2. The only way you're going to get that is if you have negative 1, negative 1. So then this would be x minus 1 squared. 4 plus 4 is a positive 5. The reason I wrote it like this is because we made this a perfect trinomial, and we know perfect trinomials are written like this. If you need to write that x minus 1 times x minus 1 equals 5, and then go to here, that's fine. Okay, and then from here, we're going to square root both sides. Get x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. If you tried to take the square root of 5, you would have gotten an irrational decimal. And we leave that. If it's not a perfect square underneath the square root, you do not actually take the actual square root of it. You leave it under the square root. Remember last time I showed you that if you square a positive 5 and if you square the negative square, or if you take the square root of 5 and square it, you still get a positive 5, which is what we want. If you take the negative square root of 5 and square that, you still get a positive 5, which is what we want. So this works. And then continuing from here, we're going to add by 1 on both sides. You get x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. And you would just leave that like that. So that would be your answer. X equals, open brackets, 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. You don't need to change that because you're not going to be able, you can't add anything to the square root of 5. I mean, if you can't add a whole number to a square root of 5, that's not going to work. It's going to, the only way you can write it is if you have 1 plus the square root of 5, and that's it. That's as simple, that's as simplified as you're going to get it. Okay, I'm going to do another. So x squared minus 2 equals 6x minus 3. Okay, remember, you want it to be, your goal is to get this to go to, we don't have an 8. Well, x squared plus bx equals c. So we want everything with an x on the left, everything without an x, you gotta move it to the right. So first things first, I'm gonna move my 6x. You can actually move them at the same time, the 2 and the 6x. And this is gonna give me x squared minus 6x minus 2 equals negative 3. And then I'm gonna add by 2. And this will give me x squared minus 6x equals a negative 1. Okay, then I'm going to take the 6. I'm going to half it, get 3, square that, get 9. If you put this in your calculator, you can actually just put 6 divided by 2 squared, and that'll give you 9. Okay, so then I'm going to add by 9 on both sides. On this one, I had remembered to leave enough space, so I could just put the plus sign in there and add it to the side, but I didn't leave enough space on this one right here. If you want to, you can. X squared minus 6x plus 9 equals a positive 8. Okay, well, doing this, you get 9, you get negative 6. You would get negative 3 and negative 3 because the factors of 9 are only 1 and 9 and 3 and 3. Well, then this would be x minus 3 squared equal to 8. Take the square root, take the square root. Well, then this would give you x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 8. Now, the thing with 8 is it can be factored to 4 times 2. So if you had the square root of 8, you would have the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, which would be 2 square roots of 2. So I'm going to rewrite the square root of 8. 2 square roots of 2. And that is what you want to do. And then from here, I'm going to add by 3 on both sides. And I'm going to get x equals 3 plus or minus 2 square roots of 2. And that's going to be your answer. Remember, check and make sure. If you have a prime number underneath your square root, then you're not going to be able to simplify it. But if you have a non-prime number underneath your square root, then try and see if you have any, any perfect squares in there. Whew. Okay. All right. So this was actually part 1 of notes. And so now we're going to be getting into part 2. And this is when a is greater than 1. Okay, so this one actually has some steps first. So again, we're going to rewrite as ax squared plus bx is equal to c. So if we have 4x squared plus 8x minus 5 equals 0, we're going to add by 5 on both sides. And then you're going to get 4x squared plus 8x equals 5. And that's step 1. Now then, step number 2 says to divide the equation by 8. I can't write in italicized A, so I'm going to write it in quotation marks. So what you're going to do right here is you're going to divide everything by the A value, which is 4. And this is going to be step number 2. All right, well then 4x squared divided by 4 is actually just going to be x squared. 8x divided by 4 is a positive 2x. But 5 divided by 4 is going to just stay as 5/4, which is fine. And then our third step is to take half of b, square it, then add this to both sides. And if you notice, this is actually step 2 on the last one. So we're going to take b, we're going to half it, and then we're going to square that. So then we're going to add 1 to both sides. Well, the left side is going to give you x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals. Now 5/4 plus 1, you'd have to change the 1 into a fraction. So since our denominator is 4, we're going to change it into the fraction 4/4, which works because this is 1/1 multiplied by 4 on top and bottom. Well, then this is going to give you 9/4. Plus, because remember when you add fractions, you add the numerators, 5 plus 4 gives you 9, and you keep the denominator of 4. Well, then this is equal to 9/4. And then our fourth step is to factor the perfect square trinomial. Okay, so then that would give you 1 and 2. That's actually only going to be 1 because the only factors of 1 is 1 in itself. So then this would be this is the fourth step right here. This is what you should get after your fourth step. You should get x plus 1 quantity squared equals 9/4. And then at last, you just need to take the square root of both sides. And solve for both cases. So then taking the square root of the left and taking the square root of the right, this will leave you with x plus 1 equals, the square root of 9/4 is going to be plus or minus 3/2. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 4 is 2. Okay, so you could either break it up right here or go -1, -1. This gives you x equals -1 plus or minus 3/2. Okay, well then you're going to have to do that right here. X equals -1 minus 3/2. Well then you have to rewrite this 1. So that'd be -2/2 minus 3/2. Well, -2 minus 3 is -5/2. Okay, well then the other side would be, I'm going to write it over here. X equals -1 plus 3/2, We already know what -1 is going to go to -2/2 plus 3/2, and that's just going to be +1/2. So as your last step, you should have x equals, up in parentheses, -5/2, comma 1/2. Now, when you're doing these steps, and you get to about here, on your fourth one, and you take the square root, and you get an irrational number like we did up here, then you're just going to follow the same steps and simplify your irrational number. There's not much. The only difference between when a is greater than 1 than when a is equal to 1 is you just have to add in this extra step of dividing by your a value to get this equal to 1, and then it's the same steps as before. All right.